Hello, I'm Chris Godber, and this is going to be a video of a very serious subject. It's a funny philosophy video. If you've never seen one of these videos I've done before, I try and talk about a subject from some sort of philosophical perspective for 20 minutes. So strap in for that, and the subject of this video, which I'll try and make as serious in tone as the subject demands, is war and peace, in terms of how that has occurred throughout human history. And I'm just going to give some of my thoughts on both of these subjects. Now, this might be a bit muddled, obviously. I've not really done much prep work before I've prepared this video. I tend to just do a stream of consciousness when I talk about these subjects. So, obviously, it's quite a it's more of a contemporary issue, unfortunately, at the minute, seeing as the world at present finds itself with two major conflicts going on in developed nations, in the Middle East, and in the East, in Ukraine-Russia war, and obviously Israel and in Gaza. And I'm not going to comment on those specific conflicts. I'm going to talk more in generalities. But yeah, okay, let's try and drill this down somewhat. So, war has been a constant, unfortunately, constant feature of pre-civilization and even in civilization. Since time immemorial, really, where there's been violence of peoples against other peoples. Obviously, most notably in the 20th century, we had the industrial wars, the wars of industrialization, World War I, and then unfortunately World War II, of course, which was the most cyclically damaging war probably in least recent living memory from some people. And the definitely the First and the Second World War remain a collective wound in the human imagination. We produce fiction about it. There's lots of poetry, obviously, written during the First World War, and we have they were obviously, of course, the first wars which were recorded with in terms of like video, photography, so people actually realized the actual horror and the cost, especially in terms of the First World War, was the first mass industrial war. And then obviously with the Second World War, similar, it was a war of attrition, technology, both sides trying to develop technology, which ultimately led to the creation of the weapon that can destroy all of us, which is the atomic bomb, right? But why do wars happen? And this is a huge question. I don't expect to cover all of it in this 20-minute video, but I'm just going to give some of my own thoughts. I wouldn't necessarily say they're going to be that insightful, but here we go. So I think most wars are a combination of factors. I think most of them emerge as a result of often resource scarcity. It could be a land conflict. You could have powers rise into power, say for example like the Nazis, obviously a good example, who want to expand their territory and have an ideology supporting their underpinning their mission, as it were, which is why they start a conflict. Obviously in the Nazis' case, they invaded Poland, and they had this whole mishmash of occultism and the National Socialist beliefs that underpinned their expansionism, Hitler's megalomania, for example. So, and also I do think resource scarcity is behind many conflicts, wanting to assert economic power and trade. Many wars have been fought over trade. Some wars have obviously been fought on religious grounds, but I'd say like in the 20th century, you could probably put to rest the argument that it's just religion that causes war. It certainly have been many religious wars, crusades, and many of the conflicts throughout history have had a religious have been because of religion in one way or the other. But it's reductive, I think, to say that all wars are due to religious factors. Now, ideologies can almost take on the quasi feeling of a religion, for sure. I mean, even though they were terrible, obviously, the Nazis had this fanaticism about, which in certain respect was, you could argue, similar to the worst aspects of zealot-like religion, right? They were zealots. They had absolute faith in their, in their case, it was a horrendous doctrine of racism, white supremacy, and trying to reassert something. Well, that's what they fought. I mean, the Nazis felt that they had to save Western civilization and create the new Germania, right? This idea of the ideal German state. And obviously, you had the scapegoating of the Jews that the Nazis did. So, I mean, that's a whole other area, like how fascism functions as an ideology. Fascism is probably worth reading on that. But they did have this almost, you could argue, quasi-mystical underpinning to their beliefs. Now, that's not to say, obviously, like I said, I'm not going edgy atheist here. I'm not saying that religion or faith is the driving factor in war. It's obviously a very complicated, many multivariant mishmash of different factors that usually drives the evolutions of war in a civilization, right? You could have civilizational decline in some respects, could economic uncertainty. There's often a trend, a pattern you can see of an economic uncertainty driving the prior to many conflicts. It was that way in the Depression, the Great Depression, which happened, which was a precursor to the wars. And yeah, but I don't want to go too off track. So I'm going to try and split this video into two parts. Obviously, it's going to be fairly rambling. I'm going to split it, try and focus the discussion on war at first. Just as I say, like I've sort of covered a bit there, what I think causes the conditions for war, what increases the chances for it. But then I'm also going to talk after that a bit about peace and what are some, I guess, consciousness raising exercises, I suppose, that the collective humanity could enact to work towards peace, which in themselves, in some respects, even touch on religious belief in the most idealistic form, right? I'm not religious myself, but I see the good parts in some of it, right? So I'm not like, not going to completely say that that's bad, because again, it's not what this video is about, but I'm repeating myself too much now. So, where should I go from here? So, I've talked about the First World War, I've talked about the Second World War. Obviously, with the age of the modern age, our efficiency, unfortunately, at being able to maim and destroy each other became so much more evolved with industrialization. Now, obviously, we've had thousands of years of wars before, but the horror of the First World War and the Second World War was so much more apparent because, as I said, it was one of the first wars that was really the media covered. There's video evidence of it all. There's photographic evidence of the Holocaust. There's photographic evidence of many of the big battles that were fought on the various territories. So we have so much recorded, archived evidence, as well as, of course, in terms of the Second World War, the trials, the Nuremberg trials, that came after the conflict itself, where it could, via the mass media for the first time, collectively as the human species were able to see from the outside in these people who had done genocidally evil things. And it gave us a bit of an insight into how that happens. The classic line with a lot of the Nazi high command was, "Oh, we're just following orders." And obviously, in the Nazi system, there was a orthodox hierarchy of, obeying the commanders in above you, right? And I mean, I've never been near a war, like I'll say that much. I know a few people who have. I've never been near one. I'm not militarily trained. I guess I do see that we probably need a military still. I'm not like a hippie that thinks, oh yeah, we can just all demilitarize and everything will be fine. It's not the world we're in. You know, we have nation states. There's a variety of complex factors at play there, right? It's not like we could just all. I mean, if we are a world organization, perhaps we could demilitarize. We'd have that. That's just ridiculously idealistic, right? I mean, somewhat unrealistic to expect that you wouldn't have groups or factions that emerge, even in some sort of utopia, that wouldn't have malevolent aims. And that's where all of the most wars revolve around power struggles in one way or the other, obviously. So you have a group or an individual who rises to power, who want to assert their power over others, whether that be by a land grab, by actual genocide, or by, yeah, they have this vision of the world. They want it to purify it, to cleanse it, or sometimes it's even more, Machiavellian. It's just want to assert more power, get more territory. So there is that aspect, obviously, because I mean, what are most ideologies are mostly geared around wanting to assert their power base. Now, part of that is natural, right? You have in the democratic ideal, you have a clashing of ideologies and then compromise, discussion, yada yada yada. But then what happens when all that breaks down is you have, actual conflict. This usually emerges, as I said, from a period of disorder or instability in the economy and civilization itself. You get these very malevolent characters like a Hitler, like a Stalin, who will rise up and take advantage of people, really. The manipulators of the masses, really. Obviously, Stalin and Hitler are good examples of that. Mao as well, I'd argue. I'm not, I don't think there's, again, like in a different way. Mao was definitely much about, cultural reprogramming, obviously cultural revolution, but I'm not going to go into that too much. Now, suffice to say, war is terrible. Nobody benefits from it, really. Sometimes, obviously, I think you could argue that there are some wars that are potentially justifiable. Obviously, I think the Allied powers in the Second World War, I mean, what choice did we have, really? It was either accept the Nazi jackboot or die if you were Jewish, a gypsy, Polish, gay, or someone who was against the Nazi order, which is most rational-minded people, right? Most people with any sort of conscience. So did we really have a choice in defending? It was a defensive war in terms of the Allied powers, right? So I do think there are justifiable cases for war. I don't think that there is no situation where it's, but I believe in terms of like how I believe it should be enacted. I think just as defensive last resort. I think I don't think that, and obviously it's obviously logically, not that everything functions on logic, but just as a logical, an obvious logical point, the only reason that you'd have to have a defensive war is if there is an offender, right? Someone who's suddenly invaded a territory or started killing people randomly, or that basically. So the only reason that the defensive aspect comes into it is because some line has been crossed. Now, again, I'm not going to talk about contemporary conflicts because they're way too complex, and I don't want to really dive into that territory too much because it's very complicated. I have lived in Russia for a while, so I know obviously a lot about what's going on there politically, and obviously against what Russia is doing in Ukraine. But again, I'm not going to wide too much into geopolitics and all the complexities of that. But I mean, right now the worry, I think, is we've obviously got several nuclear powers in conflicts currently. A lot of people would say they are sort of a proxy war. They're like almost like Ukraine's almost like a barrier in some respects from potential Putin expansionism into the West, which would essentially be the downfall of modern Western civilization. If Europe was to fall, for example, in the UK where I live, that would be the potentially. I'm not saying it necessarily, but it would be the downfall of the world as we know it. We'd then be under an autocratic regime. I mean, there's not a doubt. There's very little chance of that happening. I'm just saying, in the worst potential scenario, that would be the end game of that. Anyway, 15 minutes done. Let me talk a bit about peace. What are actual actionable aims, you as an individual or groups of people can work towards that enhance the chances of peacetime? Now, we've lived in a period of post-war peacetime, certainly in Europe and in most developed nations, relative peacetime for basically since the Second World War has finished. But we still have had conflicts going on all over the world. The Vietnam War, you'd had sort of American imperialistic wars. Again, huge grey area and sort of minefield to walk into. The Iraq-Afghanistan war, the original Gulf War, trouble in the Middle East, being fought over various ideological areas, blah, blah, blah. But anyway, that's well beyond the scope of this 20-minute video. Peace. So, one obvious way that you can enhance the chances of peaceful... I mean, it always ends up that way anyway, right? It doesn't matter... If there is a conflict, as long as it doesn't blow up the entire world, there is always a gathering of the parties involved at the end signing a peace treaty. That's always the way it ends. This is the annoying, frustrating thing if you've got any sort of morality, is that it always ends the same way. It's all a pointless exercise in death, butchering, and just violence, right? Just meaningless violence. It always ends the same way, which is round the table, people talking, coming to agreements. Obviously, I mean, people always bring this up, but the Second World War, the conditions for that were arguably created in some respects by the Treaty of Versailles, so the post-war World War I treaty. And a lot of Germans were very unhappy with the war reparations that they had to pay post the First World War, which unfortunately maybe in some respects created the conditions for the second, like resentment against having to pay this, a growing political instability in the Weimar Republic, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, peace. So I think this is going to be a bit glib. I've only got a few more minutes to discuss this, but I think in general, one of the positives we've got going for us in terms of creating a more peaceful world, even though the world, in the current state is going the other way. We have this mass communication system called the internet, which has good and bad elements, but it does mean that we're able to see much more of other people's experience and lives on social media platforms, videos. We have much more access to information than ever before. So cultures that would have once been alien, that we could have other in many respects, like in the First World War we called Germans Krauts, and we'd sort of make them the other, like stupid Krauts, blah 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 blah. We'd make them alien, we'd make them other. Obviously the Nazis did this with the Jews, making them into the hook-nosed, horrible anti-Semitic caricatures, protocols of elders of Zion crap that comes from all that unfortunate anti-Semitic propaganda at the time. So in some respects I think it's good that we have more of an insight into other people's experience. So I think in some respects, and this is a bit idealistic and wish-washy, I get it, but I think having access to be able to see and learn from other people's experiences is actually very, it's not talked about that much, but I think that's a very beneficial thing to the collective consciousness of humanity, really, that we can just peer into other people's experience, try and understand it more, I think it has, in some respects, maybe had a bit of an effect on lessening negative states of mind, such as racism, which is just one of the worst inventions of humanity. But, you know, how powerful is racism as a force? It still exists, unfortunately, but in my generation of millennials, the Zoomers, they're the least racist generations. There are still issues. You still have the supremacists, you still have the racists, but they have much less power. People take it much less seriously. So you don't get that essentializing of the other as much, right? Which is a good thing. And yeah, people will fall less for those old tricks of the far right, for example, or even the far left. I mean, if you're talking in terms of authoritarian communists, like that's a whole other discussion, really. So that's one thing. You could also make a counter argument that it increases and stokes the fire more, but that's culture wars. That's still ongoing. There is something now in the culture wars of where almost like people from minority experiences are being weaponized in a culture war. Either, you know, there's a lot of that going on with the trans debate, which I'm not going to sidetrack into that too much, but you could argue that, yeah, minorities are getting weaponized a lot more to create a sort of distrust of the other, I suppose. I've only gone into one real thing there about peace. Obviously, building institutions internationally, international partnerships is a very obvious thing, but definitely useful. I mean, the more that different nation states can communicate with each other, come to agreements and consensus. I mean, essentially, just like what we want to be too idealistic about it, the more democracy is preserved. It doesn't have to be like a Fenian type democracy where it's literally direct democracy, but where there are at least representation for all classes of people in society. That is definitely a net positive for everybody, to say the least. I mean, a lot of fascism, of course, developed as they saw themselves as this like strong, because they thought democracy was leading to degeneration, all this sort of crap. So they saw themselves as like an answer to that, and democracy being a negative thing. But I think it is definitely a positive overall. The more democratic institutions exist, because then you've got a base for discussion, at least being able to work things through. Yeah, so I've talked for 20 minutes. I've covered quite a lot there. I'm not going to go any more into, I'm not going to come up with some sort of like idea of how to ensure peace forever. And I don't even think that's even possible, unfortunately. The world is too complex for there to be peace all the time. There are genuinely terrible people in the world. I guess society has to try and lessen the impact that those people have on the world. But unfortunately, when scarcity increases, when disorder in the world increases, that's when you do get these people rising up and taking advantage of people's fears, right? Anyway, I'm not going to ramble on too much. I've already talked for 23 minutes. I hope you found at least some little thoughts you can chew on in this video, something interesting, something that might prompt some of your own thoughts. This is a huge area. I'm not going to be able to cover it all in this time frame. But I hope at least I've given you some nuggets that you can chew on, nuggets of thought. And yeah, like and subscribe if you found any of this interesting. And well, peace, to be fair.